The moment that would define the entire engagement did not begin with a grand strategy meeting or a carefully rehearsed plan. It began in the cold, biting air of a battlefield that seemed to breathe uncertainty. Snow mixed with smoke. The ground trembled under distant artillery. Visibility was low, morale was tense, and every man knew that hesitation, just a few seconds of it, could be the difference between life and death. In this chaos, the American forces faced a decision that would either collapse their lines or throw the enemy off balance. The situation was desperate, but it was also familiar. American soldiers had fought in enough chaotic, fast-moving engagements to understand one simple truth: waiting only strengthens the enemy. So when the first sign of movement came from the tree line, shadows shifting, muffled footsteps, the faint mechanical clatter of an advancing German unit, the Americans did not duck, did not retreat, and did not call for extended preparation. Instead, they counterattacked immediately, firing back with a ferocity that shocked even themselves. This instinctive reaction, forged in training grounds thousands of miles away, was the heartbeat of their doctrine. That snowy morning, the pressure on the American lines was immense. German forces were pushing hard, exploiting the terrain, using the thick forests and fog to conceal their movements. The conditions were stacked against the Americans. The cold froze rifle bolts, radio equipment malfunctioned at random, and visibility was so poor that soldiers often fired at sound rather than sight. Yet these very conditions forced a decision. Delaying even for 30 seconds would allow the enemy to close the distance, overwhelm the foxholes, seize high ground, and potentially break through the last defensive positions protecting the road behind them. The battlefield did not allow luxury. There was no time for reinforcement, no time for repositioning, no time for waiting for a coordinated plan. In those desperate moments, immediate aggression became survival. The instinct to strike fast did not appear out of nowhere. It was deeply embedded in American military doctrine. Before the war, U.S. Army training emphasized violent, decisive action the moment the enemy made contact. Officers were taught that hesitation disrupts momentum and gives the enemy control. Soldiers practiced this repeatedly during training: react quickly, fire quickly, overwhelm quickly. Even junior officers had authority to make snap decisions without waiting for higher command, which was rare in other armies of the era. This produced a unique battlefield culture. American units often responded to enemy threats with an almost reflexive counterpunch. They did not wait for perfect angles or perfect conditions. They created momentum. They took initiative. They seized any opening, even if it was small. And on this day, that doctrine was the one thing standing between their line and total collapse. When the German forces tried to exploit the fog and advance quietly, the Americans responded with the full force of their ingrained training, opening fire, advancing toward the sound of enemy footsteps, and throwing the attackers off their rhythm before they could deploy properly. In contrast, other Allied forces positioned nearby did not react with the same speed. Their doctrine, shaped by years of experience and losses, prioritized caution. They believed deeply in organized, calculated movement: fall back into cover, regroup, observe the enemy's strength, then launch a well-planned strike. Their units were trained to avoid unnecessary early casualties and to fight battles with methodical precision. This strategy worked well for them in many situations. It reduced sudden losses and preserved unit strength, especially when dealing with hidden enemies. But in moments like these, when the terrain was closing in, visibility was zero, and the enemy was meters away, those few extra seconds of caution created a gap. And in a battle where seconds could rewrite history, the gap was dangerous. Communication also played a crucial role. American units relied heavily on radio communication, even at platoon level. Radios were not perfect, they froze, malfunctioned, and sometimes emitted only static, but when they worked, they provided extraordinary speed. Orders could be passed in moments. A squad leader could shout over the radio, "Counterattack now!" and within seconds the entire flank responded. Other allies used systems that depended more on runners, signal flags, or wired field telephones, all of which were slower in chaotic weather. This allowed the Americans to react with more fluidity, as if the entire line moved with a single instinct. Equipment added another layer to the American advantage. The presence of jeeps, half-tracks, and highly mobile infantry support vehicles meant American units could reposition quickly. They could push forward in bursts, shift flanks rapidly, and maintain pressure even in awful conditions. Meanwhile, some Allied units, especially those positioned farther from the main road, were more limited in mobility. They had to move on foot, often through thick snow or mud, which made instantaneous counterattacks nearly impossible. Unit morale and dynamics also shaped the decision. Many American platoons were composed of younger men, energetic, aggressive, and often willing to take risks. Their leadership, shaped by fierce battles earlier in the war, believed deeply in momentum. When these soldiers heard movement in the fog, their instinct was not fear, it was adrenaline, action, and a determination to hold the line at any cost. This attitude gave them an edge in chaotic moments. While other Allied soldiers were not cowardly by any means, their leaders simply believed that pulling back to cover preserved strength. They valued longevity over shock action. The outcome of this immediate counterattack changed everything. The Germans, expecting a hesitant response, were stunned by the sudden eruption of American fire. Their advance stalled. Their formation broke. Shock rippled through their front line, buying the Americans the precious minutes they desperately needed to stabilize the sector. That quick retaliation shifted momentum, forcing the enemy to rethink their push. Meanwhile, the Allied units that initially took cover eventually re-entered the battle with organized, coordinated moves. They suffered fewer early casualties and maintained cohesive structure, but they temporarily lost ground. Still, their methodical approach helped secure the wider flank later on, proving that both doctrines, fast aggression and careful defense, had value depending on the moment. In the end, the split-second American decision to counterattack immediately was not reckless. It was survival. It was doctrine. It was instinct. And it was the action that prevented the line from breaking in those crucial minutes. The Allies who took cover preserved their strength for later strikes, but it was the American momentum that prevented disaster. Two doctrines, two instincts, one battlefield, and both played their part in shaping the outcome. The early hours of the morning offered no comfort, only a restless quiet broken by the distant thud of artillery. The cold seeped into uniforms, onto rifle grips, into bones. Frost clung to helmets. Breath turned instantly into fog. In that bleak stillness, the American units could sense movement beyond the tree line, but the forest concealed everything. Visibility was a luxury no one had. Snow drifted in slow, sideways flurries, blending with smoke and creating a pale, ghostly haze across the battlefield. Yet even without clear sight, the soldiers recognized the rhythm of approaching boots, the low metallic rattle of weapons being readied, the soft crunch of enemy footsteps pacing in sync. The Germans were coming again, pushing forward with calculated, disciplined intent. But what neither they nor any other Allied force expected was the sheer speed with which the Americans would respond. There was no pause, no cautious retreat, no brief attempt to measure enemy strength. Instead, as soon as the first faint silhouettes emerged from the fog, the Americans unleashed a counterattack so sudden and violent that it shattered the momentum of the enemy before the assault had fully begun. Every soldier in the American line knew why this tactic mattered. For days they had been defending positions that barely held together. Part of the reason for their rapid counterattack lay in the geography. The road behind them, the only reliable supply line for ammunition, medic teams, vehicles, and backup, was dangerously close. If the Germans broke through even a small section of the line, they could slice deep into the American rear, cut off fuel and rations, and trap entire battalions in a frozen pocket. The Americans did not have the luxury of waiting for a more favorable moment. The battlefield offered no promise that, later, would be safer. The enemy was always ready to exploit hesitation, especially in weather like this, where fog masked their approach and snow softened their footfalls. The Americans had learned the hard way that fighting defensively in such conditions played directly into German strengths. Holding the line was not enough, they had to disrupt, shock, and force the enemy back before the enemy created pressure. Their training supported this mindset. Before deploying to Europe, American units underwent drills emphasizing swift reaction. They practiced what officers called violence of action, the idea that the fastest, strongest response during first contact could dictate the rest of the engagement. An American squad leader did not wait for permission from higher command. He acted on instinct, calculating risk in seconds, not minutes. This flexibility allowed small units to behave independently yet effectively, especially when the front became chaotic. In comparison, other Allied forces nearby followed more rigid structures. Their commanders preferred regrouping, assessing the situation, and choosing a methodical path. For them, rushing headlong into a counterattack seemed reckless. They valued order. But the Americans valued momentum, and in these particular conditions, momentum became the only shield against collapse. Along the American front line, the initial burst of fire came from foxholes barely visible under layers of snow. Machine gunners swung their weapons forward, laying down suppressive fire to halt the German push. Riflemen moved in pairs, flanking through what little visibility they had, using instinct rather than sight to position themselves. Mortar teams, hearing only fragments of the enemy's advance, fired based on sound and experience. Every action was fast, coordinated through instinct more than through orders. Radios crackled with short bursts of information. Left flank moving, enemy close. Counterattack now, but the real coordination came from soldiers reacting to each other in real time. Meanwhile, the terrain created challenges the Americans were forced to embrace. Trees formed thick, jagged clusters. Snow reached up to their shins in deeper pockets. Roots hid under fresh layers of frost. A cautious army would have slowed to a crawl here, but the Americans turned these obstacles into cover. They darted between tree trunks, used fallen logs for firing rests, and advanced through patches of shadow that shielded their movement. The Germans expected resistance, but not the kind that charged straight into the fog, firing and shouting, disrupting their carefully timed advance. The suddenness of the American aggression made the German front hesitate, even if only briefly. But in a battle like this, a single moment of hesitation was all the Americans needed. Other Allied units positioned on the flanks noticed the difference immediately. They saw the Americans charging forward despite the blinding snow and freezing winds, while they themselves were still establishing defensive positions. It wasn't that these allies lacked courage. Rather, their doctrine placed emphasis on preserving strength, minimizing early casualties, and attacking only when conditions were controlled. Their officers believed that surprise counterattacks in zero visibility created unnecessary risk. Their strategy relied on gradually taking control of the engagement rather than forcing it instantly. In normal weather, this careful approach had saved lives and won battles. But on this chaotic morning, the Germans were too close, too fast, and too aggressive for caution to work immediately. One of the major advantages the Americans had was mobility. Even in deep snow, their light vehicles, jeeps and half-tracks, gave them quick bursts of repositioning capability. While jeeps could not perform miracles in freezing mud, they could shuttle ammunition, medics, and squad reinforcements between positions faster than foot soldiers. This allowed American commanders to feed small pockets of resistance exactly when they were needed. Other Allied forces lacked this immediate mobility in this particular sector. Their equipment was heavier, their positions more spread out, and their reliance on foot movements slowed their ability to launch immediate counterattacks. The weather, instead of hindering the Americans, became an unintentional tool. German soldiers had counted on the fog and snow to hide their movement. They expected the Americans to struggle with visibility and communication. But since American doctrine already relied on fast, instinctive action rather than perfect vision, the weather conditions leveled the field. The Germans lost their advantage just as the Americans gained momentum. The enemy's tight, disciplined formations became vulnerable under the sudden shock of fire. Their forward elements faltered, unsure how many Americans were pushing back, how close they were, or whether the counterattack was part of a larger maneuver. Confusion rippled through the German front. Within minutes, the initial German push lost its shape. Officers barked orders through the fog, trying to restore formation. Machine guns that should have been supporting the assault were repositioned too late. Mortar teams hesitated, uncertain of where to fire. The Americans used these chaotic seconds to press even harder. Their aggression, though risky, paid off. They forced the enemy to step back, regroup, and rethink their strategy while the Americans tightened their defensive perimeter. By the end of the engagement, the difference in doctrine was clear. The Americans had stopped the breakthrough because they struck fast. The Allied units that waited and took cover were not wrong. They preserved strength and later contributed to stabilizing the wider front. But the situation demanded a brutal, immediate punch, and only the Americans delivered it. Their counterattack was not luck or desperation. It was the result of doctrine, instinct, terrain, mobility, and the understanding that in moments like this, seconds decide everything. And on that frozen battlefield, those seconds belonged to them. The snow had begun falling again, slow, silent, relentless. It coated helmets, rifles, and the frozen ground beneath the soldiers' boots. The world had turned white, yet the battlefield felt darker than ever. Every American soldier knew that the next few minutes would determine whether their line held or collapsed. They were staring into a fog so thick it swallowed whole shapes, where enemies appeared only as faint shadows drifting between trees. At first, the forest sounded almost peaceful, but that stillness became a warning. A battlefield that goes quiet is rarely empty, it is hiding something. And the Americans could feel the shift in the air. Something was moving, something organized, something deadly. They could sense the approach before they could see it. The German assault groups were advancing, spreading out, coordinating silently under the cover of fog. But before the Germans could fully establish their momentum, something unexpected happened. The Americans struck first. No hesitation. No calculating. No waiting for the perfect moment. They launched a fierce, immediate counterattack that shattered the rhythm the Germans had spent minutes trying to build. A major reason behind this aggressive reaction was the way the Americans interpreted danger. To them, the signs were unmistakable: the subtle crunch of snow under synchronized boots, the muffled clatter of equipment, the brief flicker of movement behind a row of trees. Even if only a few soldiers saw it, the entire line reacted almost instantly. They understood that letting the enemy close the last 30 yards would be fatal. Once the Germans were at grenade-throwing distance, foxholes would become traps. Machine gun nests would be overrun. Communications would fail. So, instead of waiting for the Germans to get closer, the Americans decided the best defense was to push forward and hit the enemy before the enemy hit them. Their counterattack wasn't heroic bravado, it was tactical necessity. Another reason for the immediate response lay in the massive strain placed on their supply line. The Americans were fighting near a critical road that kept their units alive. Ammunition, fuel, medical teams, everything depended on that road remaining open. If the Germans punched even a small hole in the American defense, they could reach that road, cut it off, and leave entire companies stranded in the freezing wilderness with no hope of reinforcement. The Americans knew what was at stake. Losing that road meant losing the entire sector. And so, when the Germans attempted to push forward, the Americans responded with brutal speed. They counterattacked not because they wanted to, but because the terrain forced them to. It was either strike now or lose everything later. The weather played its own role in the drama. Snowfall and fog made visibility almost non-existent. Radios crackled more than they transmitted. Orders were short, shouted over the wind, barely heard by the next foxhole. In such conditions, armies that rely on structured, carefully timed maneuvers suffer. But the Americans thrived. Their training taught them to adapt instantly, to attack or defend without waiting for extensive instructions. Junior officers had authority to change plans on the spot. Squad leaders were trusted to make decisions that other armies would only allow higher-ranking officers to make. This flexibility made the American line more reactive, more unpredictable, more explosive. In moments where other Allied units paused to understand the situation, the Americans were already moving. The German assault groups expected hesitation. They were used to American forces taking cover first, trying to identify the direction of incoming fire, gathering information before committing to action. But this time the Americans switched the equation entirely. The Germans emerged from the trees expecting a scattered American reaction, but instead met a wall of gunfire. Machine gunners opened up before German officers could deploy their support weapons. Riflemen didn't wait for perfect accuracy, they fired at shapes, at sounds, at shadows. The initial burst stunned the attackers, breaking their formation before they were fully ready to charge. Other Allied forces near the flanks watched this unfold differently. Their doctrine emphasized caution and survival. They moved back into more defensible positions when the fog thickened. They avoided early engagement. Their officers preferred to study enemy movement, then strike with precision. Their approach, while smart in many battles, was too slow for this moment. The Germans were already too close, too numerous, too coordinated. Waiting meant allowing the enemy to dictate the outcome. And even though the Allies' defensive positions were strong, they required time to set up, time the battlefield simply did not give them. American mobility became another decisive factor. Even in terrible weather, the Americans still had jeeps, half-tracks, and lightly equipped infantry squads capable of shifting positions quickly. The terrain was awful, mud, ice, snowdrifts, but these vehicles didn't need to go fast. They only needed to move faster than men on foot. Ammunition was rushed to the front line in minutes. Reinforcements were pushed forward quickly enough to maintain pressure. When the Germans expected the Americans to run low on firepower, fresh bandoliers and mortar rounds suddenly appeared. Other Allied forces, particularly those further from the road, lacked this speed. Their resupply came slower, their lines were more stretched, and their counterattack capability was limited. The Germans also underestimated how weather distorted sound. Footsteps echoed strangely, gunshots ricocheted off trees, and the fog absorbed noise unpredictably. The Americans used this to their advantage. They made their counterattack seem larger than it was. They shouted, fired rapidly, and advanced in short, violent bursts. The Germans, confused by distorted sound, believed they were facing a much larger force. Their forward elements hesitated. And hesitation on a battlefield is a crack that grows into a collapse. Within minutes, the German offensive lost its power. Their front wavered, their communication broke, and their officers struggled to regain control. The Americans didn't give them the chance. They surged forward once more, not a full advance, but a controlled, aggressive push designed to force the enemy to retreat just far enough to break their momentum completely. Once the Germans pulled back to reorganize, the danger was over. The critical minutes had passed, and the line survived because the Americans did not wait. The other Allies used the time bought by the American counterattack to strengthen their own defenses. Their methodical approach paid off later in the day when they launched calculated counterstrikes that further stabilized the wider sector. Their caution preserved manpower. Their discipline prevented unnecessary losses. But in those first few minutes, when the German assault was at its strongest, the battlefield demanded a response that only the Americans were willing to make. In the end, the contrast in tactics defined the engagement. One side counterattacked instantly, refusing to surrender even a single foot of ground. The other Allies took cover, regrouped, and fought according to their own doctrine. Both approaches mattered. Both contributed to holding the line. But it was the American willingness to strike first, fast, and decisively that prevented the enemy from breaking through during the most critical moment of the battle. Their instinct saved the road, saved their units, and ultimately, saved the entire sector from collapse. The cold air cut like a blade, sharp enough to numb fingers even through thick gloves. Snow rolled across the battlefield in thin sheets, carried by a wind that seemed determined to swallow both armies whole. But beneath that harsh winter silence, something deadly was living in the fog. The Americans in the forward positions could feel it in the way the forest grew unnervingly still, in the way sound traveled strangely as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Moments before the enemy revealed themselves, there was a tension that hung so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing on every soldier's shoulders. And then, as if materializing from the fog itself, the German forces emerged. Silent, weapons ready, formations tight, their movements sharp and rehearsed. They came with speed and confidence, believing they held the advantage. But before they could fully unleash their attack, the Americans did something that changed everything. They counterattacked instantly, with a sudden ferocity that caught the Germans completely off guard. The Americans didn't act out of recklessness. They acted out of necessity. They understood exactly what would happen if they allowed the enemy to close the distance. The Germans weren't approaching as a scattered group. They were advancing in coordinated assault teams designed to overwhelm positions quickly. If they reached grenade range, foxholes would be destroyed, heavy weapons would be lost, communications would collapse, and the defensive line, already stretched thin, would break wide open. The Americans knew that if they waited even a few seconds longer, the enemy would dictate the fight. So instead of falling back or seeking cover, they surged forward with immediate aggression, firing rapidly and advancing in bursts through the snowy haze. It was a decision that ran against instinct. Most soldiers in that situation would hide, but their survival depended on flipping the situation before the Germans could seize control. This instinctive reaction came from more than battlefield experience. It came from doctrine. American training drilled into soldiers the idea that violent, decisive action during initial contact was the key to survival. While other armies emphasized cautious withdrawal or perfectly coordinated responses, the Americans were taught that momentum could be a weapon just as powerful as artillery or armor. And on this bitter morning, momentum became the only thing standing between them and disaster. The fog, the snow, and the terrain all favored the attacker. The Germans believed their approach was hidden, silent, masked by weather. They never expected the Americans to react faster than they could form up. But that's exactly what happened. As soon as movement flickered between the trees, American rifles opened fire. Machine guns roared. Mortars thumped. The German assault groups found themselves under intense pressure before their officers could shout the first command. Other Allied units in the sector watched this unfold with a mixture of admiration and confusion. Their doctrine called for caution. They were trained to fall back into better defensive positions, assess the scale of the threat, and regroup before committing to any counterattack. Their officers valued organization, precision, and minimizing early casualties. To them, launching an immediate counterattack in low visibility, against an unknown number of German troops, seemed unnecessarily risky. And in many battles, their method was the safer one. But on this day, in this weather, and in this terrain, caution created a dangerous gap. The Germans were advancing too quickly for a measured response. If the Americans had followed the same doctrine, the enemy would have overrun the entire forward line before reinforcements could be organized. Terrain played a deadly role as well. The forest wasn't thick enough to stop bullets, but it was dense enough to distort visibility and conceal movement. Snow-covered routes created hidden hazards. Slopes dipped sharply, then rose again, creating pockets where soldiers could disappear from sight even at close range. The Germans had practiced using terrain like this to their advantage. Their assault teams were trained to slip through trees quietly, using the environment as natural camouflage. But the Americans countered this by refusing to let the enemy get comfortable. Their sudden burst of fire forced the Germans out of their chosen hiding spots, pushing them into the open where visibility improved just enough to pick targets. Mobility gave the Americans another edge. While deep winter made movement difficult, their lighter, more flexible units could shift positions faster than the German assault teams expected. Jeeps and half-tracks couldn't reach the front line itself, but they got ammunition and reinforcements close enough that soldiers could carry them the rest of the way. This constant flow of support kept American firepower high. Other Allied units lacked this advantage in the moment. Their heavier equipment and more spread-out formations meant they couldn't reinforce their front as quickly. And in a chaotic battle, even a few minutes' delay could mean the difference between holding and collapsing. Communication played a subtle but crucial role. American radios, though imperfect in the cold, still provided faster coordination than the systems used by nearby Allied forces. Even when static cut-through transmissions, short bursts of information were enough to coordinate a counterattack. A single message, "Push forward now," could ripple through the line in seconds. Meanwhile, other allies relied more on shouted orders, field phones, or runners, all of which were unreliable in snow and fog. The Americans, despite the chaos, operated almost like a single organism, each squad reading and reacting to the other's movements. The initial assault broke the German momentum. Confusion rippled through their ranks. They had expected to surprise the Americans, not to be met with overwhelming fire so quickly. Their officers struggled to reorganize. Machine gun teams couldn't deploy in time. Mortar crews hesitated, unsure where to fire in the blinding fog. The assault groups that had trained to swarm forward found themselves pinned down before they could even advance. The Americans, sensing the shift, pressed harder, not recklessly, but with controlled aggression designed to force the enemy back just far enough to break their rhythm completely. Meanwhile, the Allied units that had initially taken cover finally regrouped and re-entered the battle with their more organized, methodical approach. Their slower, calculated strikes helped secure the flanks and stabilize the broader front. Their caution preserved their strength for later phases of the fight. But the critical moment, the one that prevented the Germans from breaching the line, belonged to the Americans and their immediate counterattack. By the end of the engagement, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Two different doctrines had clashed with the same enemy. One launched a rapid, instinctive, aggressive counterattack. The other took cover first, regrouped, and returned with precision. Both contributed to the final victory. But the truth was clear: if the Americans had hesitated for even a few seconds, the Germans would have shattered the defense. Their instant reaction didn't just disrupt the attack, it saved the sector. It turned the tide. It proved that sometimes, survival belongs not to the most cautious, but to the fastest. The forest was shaking with tension long before the shooting even started. Snow clung to branches in thick white layers, muting every sound, making the battlefield feel padded and distant, like a world suspended between breaths. But beneath that deceptive quiet, something critical was happening. American radios, scattered up and down the frozen line, crackled with short, clipped messages, barely audible through static, yet powerful enough to change the course of the fight. Movement left. Fog thickening. Prepare to push. These weren't long instructions or detailed briefings. They didn't need to be. American forces had an advantage that few other armies on the field could match that winter morning: speed of communication. Even in brutal conditions, their radios could link platoons, squads, and officers with lightning efficiency, channeling information faster than the enemy could act. And that advantage, though invisible, was about to become the difference between collapse and survival. While the Germans advanced silently through the fog, their units relied heavily on runners, whistles, and prearranged signals. Visibility was too low for hand signs, and shouting across the snow-dampened forest only risked giving away positions. The enemy was well trained, no doubt, but winter and terrain dulled many of the tools they depended on. American units, despite facing the same conditions, had something more flexible at their disposal. Their radios didn't always work perfectly. Static and cold could choke transmissions. But even broken, distorted messages traveled faster than a runner stumbling through snowdrifts, or an officer trying to relay commands verbally. When the Germans began forming up for their assault, American squad leaders already knew approximately where they were coming from. They didn't know every detail, but they knew enough. And enough was all the Americans ever needed to act. The moment the first radio report confirmed movement, American officers didn't ask for reinforcements or permission. They relayed a single order across the line: counterattack immediately. That message went out fast, in seconds, reaching units that were half frozen in foxholes, crouched behind fallen logs, or guarding blind sections of forest. Soldiers who had barely exchanged words in the last hour now moved as if a single mind drove them. Machine gun teams adjusted their arcs. Mortar crews lifted charges with shaking hands. Riflemen checked magazines and tightened helmet straps. The enemy expected confusion, fragmentation, hesitation. Instead, the Americans synchronized with startling precision, forming a line that reacted far faster than the Germans believed possible. For the Allied units fighting beside the Americans, this sudden synchronization felt almost unreal. Their own communication networks required more time, more confirmations, more adjustments, more checks before committing to a maneuver as dangerous as a counterattack. Their doctrines emphasized gathering information and coordinating formations properly before taking action. Radios were used sparingly, reserved for essential communication, not rapid-fire coordination like the Americans were executing. The difference was stark. While these allies began repositioning, trying to interpret enemy movement through fog and snow, the Americans were already advancing. The terrain made communication even more complicated. Snow-laden hills and clusters of trees created dead zones where sound simply vanished. A whistle blown just a few dozen yards away could be completely muffled by thick branches. Shouts bounced off frozen trunks, becoming distorted echoes rather than directions. But radio waves, even weakened, pierced through these obstacles better than human voices ever could. American officers didn't need to see their soldiers or shout across the battlefield. They spoke into microphones, and their orders spread like electricity down a wire. Shift right. Hold fire. Advance 3 yards. These tiny adjustments, made quickly and repeated down the line, gave the American counterattack a fluidity that made it far more effective than its size suggested. The Germans, expecting to catch the Americans unprepared, suddenly found themselves pinned down by coordinated fire. Machine guns opened up from the flanks, perfectly timed with mortar bursts that landed dangerously close to their advancing columns. Rifle squads surged forward before the Germans could deploy their own support teams. The fog that should have given the attackers an advantage instead trapped them in a narrow corridor of deadly American fire. Confusion spread through the German front. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Some groups attempted to advance while others tried to fall back. Their entire rhythm, so carefully built during the approach, broke apart under the pressure of a force reacting faster than expected. On the American side, radios continued to churn out short, essential updates. Even when messages were partly lost in static, enough words made it through to maintain cohesion. A single phrase, "left flank pressure," was all a squad leader needed to reposition his men. A broken sentence, "mortars, adjust, 20 yards," gave mortar teams just enough data to correct their aim. And when one machine gun nest reported they were running low on ammunition, a nearby jeep crew immediately pivoted to deliver supplies, guided by radio pings rather than sight. Other Allied units observed how differently the Americans operated. Their own communication systems lagged behind, not due to lack of skill, but due to structure. Orders passed through more layers. Messages required more confirmation. In battles fought under clear skies and stable terrain, this precision was invaluable. But in this frozen, fog-shrouded forest, precision slowed them down. They contributed to the fight later, stabilizing the flanks and reinforcing the defenses, but the initial clash, the one that prevented the Germans from punching a fatal hole through the line, was shaped entirely by American communications superiority. Even as the Germans attempted a second push, the Americans were already responding to it in real time. Radio reports indicated shifting movement, and within moments, American units reoriented. A machine gun team swiveled its barrel. A squad crept through snow-laden brush to guard a blind angle. Mortars fired preemptively at suspected approach routes. It wasn't perfect coordination, no battle ever is, but it was fast, reactive, and tightly woven by short bursts of communication that allowed soldiers to act independently yet cohesively. By the time the Germans realized their assault had failed, the Americans had pushed them back far enough to stabilize the sector. What followed was a more methodical fight, where Allied units joined with structured tactics and stronger formations. But the moment that mattered, the spark that prevented collapse, belonged to communication. It belonged to the speed of American radios, the instinct of American officers, and the trust placed in soldiers to act with initiative. In the end, the difference between immediate counterattack and taking cover wasn't just doctrine or courage. It was communication, fast, flexible, and decisive. And on that frozen battlefield, those crackling radios carry not just orders, but survival. The moment the first shells struck, American soldiers reacted not with hesitation but with a swift, instinctive counterattack, a behavior that distinguished them sharply from other Allied forces who initially sought cover and regrouping. This immediate counteroffensive was rooted in a combination of training, doctrine, and cultural mindset that emphasized aggression, initiative, and seizing the tactical advantage rather than waiting for circumstances to stabilize. Unlike some Allied units, which had been conditioned to maintain defensive positions until a clear assessment of enemy strength could be made, American troops were drilled to act decisively, relying on speed and surprise as force multipliers. In many cases, this rapid response caught opposing forces off guard, creating temporary disarray in enemy ranks that could be exploited before reinforcements arrived. The psychological component of American combat philosophy also played a crucial role. Soldiers were encouraged to overcome fear through action, converting adrenaline and the natural shock of attack into forward momentum rather than retreat. This contrasted with the more cautious approach seen in other national forces, where hesitation often stemmed from rigid command hierarchies, fear of ambush, or prior experiences that reinforced the value of defensive patience. On the battlefield, these differences manifested in the timing and nature of engagements. Where a British or Canadian unit might dig in behind cover, waiting for artillery coordination or orders from higher command, American squads often surged forward with individual initiative, using suppressive fire and flanking maneuvers to destabilize enemy positions immediately. The doctrine of combined arms in the U.S. Army and Marine Corps reinforced this tendency, emphasizing the integration of infantry, artillery, and armor in rapid, coordinated assaults that leveraged speed as a weapon in itself. Historical examples illustrate how this approach could yield dramatic results. During the early stages of key campaigns, such as in the Pacific Island hopping operations or during the Normandy breakout, American counterattacks disrupted entrenched enemy defenses that might have otherwise resisted a slower, more measured advance. These assaults often forced adversaries to abandon prepared positions or redirect resources, illustrating how initiative and audacity could substitute for numerical superiority or prolonged planning. Another critical factor was the training regimen of American forces, which stressed realistic, high-pressure exercises designed to simulate sudden enemy contact. Drill instructors intentionally exposed recruits to chaotic, unpredictable conditions, fostering the habit of immediate reaction under fire. By contrast, some Allied nations, particularly those with a recent history of static trench warfare, trained soldiers to prioritize caution, concealment, and methodical engagement over spontaneous aggression. The combination of doctrinal emphasis and immersive training created a mindset in which hesitation was framed as a liability rather than a prudential choice. Leadership style further influenced these outcomes. American officers at multiple levels were expected to empower subordinates to make rapid decisions without waiting for explicit orders. This decentralized command structure, often referred to as mission command in modern terminology, allowed junior leaders and even individual soldiers to seize fleeting opportunities, turning the initiative into a force multiplier. In contrast, Allied forces with stricter chains of command sometimes saw delays as soldiers awaited confirmation or feared repercussions for acting outside the immediate instructions of superiors. The terrain and operational context also amplified the effects of immediate counterattacks. In fluid combat situations, such as urban fights or amphibious landings, speed and decisiveness could prevent the enemy from regrouping or establishing interlocking fields of fire. Conversely, a more cautious force that paused to assess every threat risked losing the opportunity to dictate the pace and location of engagements, effectively ceding the advantage to an opponent prepared for defensive action. Morale and esprit de corps were deeply intertwined with these tactical differences. Soldiers conditioned to respond aggressively gained confidence with each successful counterattack, reinforcing the behavior through a positive feedback loop. Seeing comrades take the initiative and succeed in disrupting enemy positions bolstered individual courage and cohesion, whereas a culture of cautious waiting could breed uncertainty, indecision, and a slower tempo of operations. Intelligence and reconnaissance also fed into the decision to counterattack immediately. American units were trained to make rapid interpretations of limited information, acting decisively on what could be observed rather than waiting for complete data. This willingness to act on imperfect intelligence sometimes carried risks, but it also allowed for opportunities to exploit gaps or weaknesses in enemy deployments before they could be reinforced or fortified. The combination of doctrine, training, leadership style, morale, an operational environment created a distinct pattern in American combat behavior. Counterattacking immediately became not just a tactical choice but a systemic habit that distinguished them from allies. Over time, this approach contributed to battlefield momentum, forcing enemies into reactive postures and shaping the broader course of engagements. While the more cautious behavior of other Allied forces had its own advantages, particularly in reducing casualties and maintaining structural cohesion, the American style of immediate counterattack often yielded decisive, if riskier, results. Ultimately, understanding why Americans counterattacked immediately requires examining the interplay of multiple factors: institutionalized aggression in doctrine, rigorous realistic training, decentralized leadership empowering initiative, psychological conditioning, operational tempo, and the reinforcing effects of morale and early success. This convergence of elements created a battlefield culture in which swift, aggressive action was not only encouraged but expected, producing outcomes that repeatedly distinguished American forces from their Allied counterparts in both perception and tangible military effect. The seventh aspect of understanding why Americans launched immediate counterattacks lies in the cultural and psychological mindset that shaped the American soldier long before reaching the battlefield. Unlike some Allied nations, where military tradition emphasized strict obedience and caution, American forces were steeped in a culture that celebrated initiative, risk-taking, and personal responsibility. This ethos did not emerge in a vacuum. It reflected decades of societal influences, from frontier histories emphasizing self-reliance and quick thinking to educational and civic systems that valued problem-solving under pressure. In combat, this translated into an instinctive readiness to seize the moment rather than defer action, even in the face of uncertainty. Commanders capitalized on this cultural trait by reinforcing it through tactical doctrine and real-world training exercises, ensuring that soldiers internalized a pattern of responding aggressively when confronted with enemy contact. The difference between American and other Allied forces became starkly visible in moments of crisis. While a British or Canadian unit might pause to establish cover, call in supporting fire, or await higher-level directives, American units were often already moving, engaging the enemy, and disrupting defensive plans. This was not mere bravado. It was a calculated integration of speed, initiative, and opportunistic aggression designed to maximize the impact of limited forces. Psychological resilience also played a critical role. American soldiers were trained to convert fear and shock into forward momentum, rather than freezing or withdrawing. Drills, live-fire exercises, and simulated ambushes created conditions in which immediate action became an almost reflexive response, and hesitation was framed as a potential threat to both personal survival and unit cohesion. This contrasts sharply with some Allied forces, whose training and operational experiences reinforced caution as a protective measure, producing a slower reaction to sudden attacks. Leadership philosophy intertwined closely with this behavior. American officers were instructed to delegate authority and encourage decision-making at lower levels, fostering a climate where subordinates were empowered to act decisively without waiting for formal approval. This decentralization allowed for rapid adaptation in the fluid chaos of battle, transforming small unit initiative into a strategic advantage. Conversely, more hierarchical Allied structures sometimes delayed action as soldiers awaited orders, reducing responsiveness and forfeiting momentum. The nature of American training further reinforced immediate counteraction. From the earliest stages, recruits were immersed in scenarios that replicated high-stress, unpredictable combat environments, emphasizing quick thinking, adaptability, and aggressive responses. These immersive exercises conditioned soldiers to view hesitation as a tactical liability, training them to act even when information was incomplete or the situation ambiguous. The operational environment amplified these tendencies. Rapid counterattacks often prevented enemies from consolidating positions or reinforcing weak points, allowing Americans to dictate the pace and location of engagement. This approach was particularly effective in urban and amphibious operations, where speed and surprise could nullify prepared defensive measures. In contrast, more deliberate approaches by other Allied forces sometimes ceded the initiative, giving opponents time to reorganize, entrench, or counterattack themselves. The effect on morale and cohesion cannot be overstated. Each successful counterattack reinforced confidence, camaraderie, and a sense of agency among troops. Soldiers witnessing peers take decisive action and achieve tangible results developed a collective expectation that acting swiftly was the proper and effective response. Conversely, units conditioned to pause or rely solely on orders often faced moments of indecision that could erode morale and reduce operational effectiveness. Another factor contributing to immediate counteraction was the American approach to intelligence and reconnaissance. Rather than waiting for perfect or exhaustive information, soldiers and small unit leaders were trained to act on what could be observed, using rapid judgment to exploit vulnerabilities. This willingness to act on incomplete intelligence carried risks but also allowed opportunities to disrupt enemy formations before they could respond effectively, generating tactical advantages that reinforced the doctrine of immediate counterattack. Over the course of multiple campaigns, the pattern became self-reinforcing. Successes from immediate counterattacks validated doctrine, shaped training, and strengthened the cultural mindset, creating a feedback loop in which bold action was increasingly viewed as both necessary and effective. Meanwhile, Allied forces that relied on caution and defensive positioning could see advantages in minimizing casualties but often at the cost of losing initiative, tempo, and battlefield control. The interplay between doctrine, training, leadership, psychology, and operational conditions thus created a distinctive American combat identity. Immediate counterattacks were not random acts of bravery but the result of systemic factors that converged to produce a force highly attuned to speed, aggression, and seizing fleeting opportunities. These engagements frequently imposed dilemmas on enemy forces, forcing them into reactive postures and preventing them from executing longer-term defensive strategies. Ultimately, understanding the seventh dimension of why Americans counterattacked immediately illuminates a broader pattern, a military culture that valorizes initiative, decisive action, and adaptability, supported by training, leadership philosophy, and morale, produced a combat force capable of turning the shock of attack into a decisive offensive advantage. When analyzed alongside other Allied approaches, the contrast is striking. While caution and cover might minimize risk, the American emphasis on rapid, proactive engagement created opportunities that shaped the outcomes of battles, accelerated operational tempo, and demonstrated how cultural, psychological, and doctrinal factors combined to define national approaches to warfare. American forces' tendency to counterattack immediately, while other Allied units often took cover first, can be traced to a combination of operational philosophy, battlefield experience, and the unique organizational culture of the U.S. military. From the earliest stages of training, American soldiers were taught that initiative and speed were essential to survival and success in combat. Drill exercises simulated sudden attacks and chaotic engagements, conditioning troops to respond without hesitation. In these scenarios, hesitation was treated as a vulnerability, while immediate action was reinforced as a tactical strength. The combination of rigorous training and a culture of decisiveness created a mindset in which soldiers instinctively seized opportunities rather than waiting for orders or evaluating risks at length. Leadership doctrine further reinforced this behavior. American officers were empowered to make rapid decisions and, more importantly, to empower their subordinates to act independently. This decentralization ensured that in the heat of battle, junior leaders and even individual soldiers could execute counterattacks based on real-time assessments, turning initiative into a force multiplier. Other Allied nations, by contrast, often maintained more hierarchical command structures where lower-level soldiers were expected to await explicit orders, slowing their response time and giving the enemy a temporary advantage. The operational context also played a significant role. Many American engagements occurred in dynamic, fluid environments, dense jungles, urban terrain, or islands where lines were not clearly defined. In these situations, rapid counterattacks could prevent enemy forces from consolidating positions or exploiting disorganization, allowing Americans to dictate the tempo of battle. Speed and surprise became as valuable as firepower, often neutralizing the numerical or positional advantages of opponents. Psychological conditioning was equally important. Soldiers were trained to convert fear and stress into proactive action. The shock of enemy attack did not paralyze troops but instead triggered a learned response of immediate aggression. Each successful counterattack reinforced confidence, creating a feedback loop in which troops increasingly relied on swift action as both a defensive and offensive measure. The contrast with other Allied forces was stark. Soldiers accustomed to cautious, defensive approaches sometimes hesitated to engage until they had full information or artillery support, which, while reducing immediate risk, often forfeited momentum and ceded control to a more aggressive adversary. Intelligence and reconnaissance practices in the American military also encouraged rapid action. Troops were trained to interpret limited or evolving information quickly, using judgment to exploit fleeting weaknesses in enemy formations. This reliance on adaptability and improvisation, rather than complete situational certainty, allowed for swift countermeasures that could destabilize opponents before they could react effectively. The interplay between training, doctrine, and environment created a systemic pattern. Successes achieved through immediate counterattacks validated the approach, influencing future training and operations and embedding the behavior into the organizational culture. Over time, this pattern reinforced itself, producing a force where aggressive initiative became standard procedure rather than exceptional heroism. Tactical advantages of this approach were numerous. Rapid counterattacks often disrupted enemy coordination, forced defensive repositioning, and inflicted disproportionate losses relative to the size of the attacking force. These actions also preserved American operational tempo, preventing enemy forces from dictating the pace and location of engagements. Conversely, caution-focused strategies prioritized minimizing casualties and maintaining order but frequently ceded initiative and left troops reacting rather than acting. Leadership philosophy reinforced these outcomes at multiple levels. Officers were evaluated not solely on meticulous planning but on their ability to adapt, seize opportunities, and inspire immediate action in their units. This emphasis on flexible decision-making ensured that even small-scale engagements could be decisive if executed with speed and precision. Morale and unit cohesion were strengthened as soldiers observed the tangible benefits of immediate counteraction. Witnessing successful maneuvers validated the doctrine, bolstered confidence, and reinforced trust in both leadership and fellow soldiers. In practical terms, this approach was evident across multiple theaters of World War II. From the Pacific Campaign's rapid amphibious engagements to the fast-moving advances across Normandy, American units repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to transition instantly from defense to offense, exploiting opportunities while their opponents were still reacting. These actions not only achieved immediate tactical gains but also shaped operational momentum, influencing the broader course of campaigns. Ultimately, the American preference for immediate counterattacks was not a product of chance or reckless bravery. It was the result of a deliberate convergence of factors. Rigorous training, adaptive leadership, psychological conditioning, operational philosophy, and cultural emphasis on initiative combined to produce a combat force capable of turning sudden attacks into offensive opportunities. This systemic approach created a distinctive combat identity, one in which decisive action and rapid response were fundamental to success, differentiating American forces from their Allied counterparts who often emphasized caution and defensive preparation. The strategic and tactical implications of this behavior were profound, shaping the outcomes of engagements, dictating the tempo of operations, and demonstrating how doctrine and culture together could produce consistent battlefield advantages. The final layer in understanding why Americans counterattacked immediately while other Allied forces often took cover first lies in the synthesis of all prior elements into a cohesive operational and cultural identity. By the time American forces engaged in large-scale combat, the combination of doctrine, training, leadership philosophy, morale, and battlefield experience had produced a force that instinctively valued rapid, decisive action. This was more than a habit. It was a calculated and systemic approach to warfare. From the earliest training exercises, soldiers were conditioned to act under pressure, to exploit enemy weaknesses the moment they appeared, and to convert the shock of sudden contact into offensive momentum. This conditioning extended from individual soldiers to small unit leaders and up to field commanders, creating a distributed pattern of initiative that allowed rapid, coordinated counterattacks without requiring constant oversight. The doctrine emphasized flexibility, adaptability, and opportunism. American forces were trained to interpret limited intelligence quickly, to anticipate enemy reactions, and to act before adversaries could consolidate defenses. Whereas other Allied troops often waited for comprehensive reconnaissance or detailed orders, Americans relied on judgment honed through practice and experience. This reliance on initiative turned small skirmishes into decisive local engagements, often tipping broader operational balances in favor of the Americans. Leadership played a pivotal role in cementing this behavior. Officers were encouraged to delegate authority, empowering subordinate commanders to make real-time tactical decisions. This decentralized approach ensured that immediate counterattacks could occur wherever opportunities presented themselves, without the delays inherent in hierarchical command structures. In contrast, units conditioned to await explicit directives frequently lost the element of surprise or the ability to dictate the pace of combat. Psychological resilience was intertwined with doctrine and leadership. American soldiers were trained to respond to fear and confusion not by freezing or retreating but by acting aggressively. Repeated exposure to high-pressure drills and realistic combat simulations reinforced confidence and trust, both in themselves and in their units. Each successful counterattack further reinforced this pattern, creating a self-perpetuating cycle in which immediate, aggressive action became the expected and rational response to enemy engagement. Operational environments amplified the impact of this approach. In fluid theaters like Pacific Islands, European hedgerows, or urban combat zones, rapid counterattacks prevented opponents from organizing or exploiting their positions. Speed and surprise allowed smaller American units to achieve disproportionate effects, turning local advantages into strategic outcomes. The combination of aggressive action, operational flexibility, and psychological conditioning ensured that American forces often maintained initiative, dictating not just the timing of engagements, but also the rhythm and direction of battles. Intelligence and reconnaissance practices reinforced the effectiveness of immediate counteraction. Soldiers were trained to make quick decisions based on incomplete information, acting on observed enemy dispositions and anticipated maneuvers. While this carried inherent risk, it also allowed for rapid exploitation of vulnerabilities, catching adversaries unprepared and generating momentum that more cautious forces could not achieve. Morale and cohesion were enhanced by the visible effectiveness of counterattacks. Soldiers observing successful engagements gained confidence, trust in leadership, and a sense of agency, reinforcing the cultural norm that decisive action was both necessary and effective. This psychological reinforcement made hesitation increasingly rare, embedding a mindset of immediate counteroffensive response across units. Historical examples illustrate the consistent success of this approach. From Pacific amphibious landings where rapid assaults prevented entrenched Japanese defenses from stabilizing, to the European campaigns where quick American counterattacks repelled breakthroughs and exploited enemy overextensions, the pattern repeated across multiple theaters. Each successful engagement validated doctrine, strengthened morale, and reinforced the habit of immediate action, creating a feedback loop that shaped the broader operational identity of American forces. Importantly, this approach did not eschew caution entirely. American counterattacks were coordinated with supporting fire, reconnaissance, and tactical planning. The difference lay in tempo and decisiveness. Rather than waiting for perfect conditions, Americans acted swiftly, exploiting opportunities and mitigating risks through training, leadership, and situational awareness. By contrast, Allied forces that prioritized cover and cautious assessment sometimes sacrificed momentum, allowing opponents to dictate the pace and forcing reactive operations. Ultimately, the American tendency to counterattack immediately reflects a synthesis of multiple systemic factors: institutionalized doctrine emphasizing initiative, rigorous and realistic training, decentralized leadership encouraging adaptive decision-making, psychological conditioning promoting resilience and aggression, operational doctrine valuing tempo and surprise, and cumulative battlefield experience reinforcing these behaviors. Together, these elements created a distinctive combat culture in which rapid, decisive action was both a tactical method and a defining characteristic of the force. The contrast with other Allied approaches underscores the effectiveness of this philosophy. Where caution and cover could preserve strength, immediate counteraction often generated initiative, tactical advantage, and operational momentum. Understanding this final layer provides a comprehensive view of why Americans acted with such decisiveness in battle, demonstrating that their behavior was not incidental but the product of an integrated system designed to exploit opportunity, maintain pressure, and shape the battlefield in their favor. By the culmination of training, doctrine, leadership, and experience, immediate counterattacks became not only a tactic but a hallmark of American operational identity, leaving a lasting imprint on the conduct and outcomes of World War II engagements.